Okay, so welcome back. Part two of our look at design systems. So I want to look at the actual process you go through of getting started with one. You've got your logo, you've got your big nebulous brand doc, you've got all the things you need to get started. How do you actually go about building one of these things? What are some issues there? There's a flawed thinking that perhaps you need everything up front before you actually start building. The idea is like we'll spend a few weeks just building our design system, and then when that's published and ready, then we'll start building the website. But that's kind of almost never going to work in practice. Firstly is that most of the time they're getting introduced to an already built system. Usually something kind of legacy or kind of messy already exists, and you're sort of saying like, let's try and add a system around this to help us get some control for any future rebuilds. Or like you want to start building out some rules, but timelines mean you need to also start building the real thing. Well, that's kind of fine, because firstly, you won't know what patterns you need, you won't know what problems you're going to run into until you've actually started building. So that's kind of a helpful thing that the thing can work alongside. Every time you run into a problem, you decide on what you're going to do, you decide on a rule, and you document it. And that way you can have a living document that works alongside your building process. That's probably going to lead to much more constructive documentation at the end of it. But it also makes sense to build as you need rather than some top-down list. It's easy to make a set of lists, but not actually follow through on it. There's some really good examples. So Material, the Google Material has got amazing stuff about layout. Here they just talk about grid and component density. It's really good if you've got quite a dense page with lots of information. You should make sure you add extra spacing, because that's going to be just too much density of content on the page. It's going to be too overbearing. So they say, don't do this. Don't leave tiny gaps, because this just looks too squeezed. There's not enough space. What would be good is just make sure you always leave space. So that's not a component, that's kind of a design rule, but it's also driven from this idea of trying to make sure that information is clear and useful. This would only come up really, you can't decide on that before you start building anything. I think it's something that people would, on a page-by-page basis, start to feel like we need to make a ruling here because of something's becoming a bit too complicated. Adobe have got a whole section in their brand docs about voice and tone, which is something you might think is not really a design decision. It's very copy driven. They're talking about rational, human, focused. They've then got this spectrum of tone: motivational, helpful, instructive, reassuring, supportive, and examples of like text which fits in line with those tones. I guess obviously Adobe produce software. It's going to give you feedback about what's working, what isn't. They're going to give you error messages and blunt things. They're going to give you instructions and guides. So they need to think a lot about how to onboard their users, how to help them navigate, but also make them to feel supported and appreciated while they run through these things. So that's really nice that they've really thought and actually felt the need to document down what the different types of tone are and where we want to use those to make sure it's a focused part of everything they build. Apple, the old kings of cool, in their guidelines have got a whole section about animation. Obviously everyone loves animations on MacBooks, so they've got that kind of swish kind of slick, cool way of working. So they've actually included examples of animations. Strive for realism. Realistic movement can help people understand how something works. When using mission control to reveal the desktop, all open windows slide out of the way as if you're swiping physical papers out the way on a desk. So they're thinking very much about their animations. It's important that they work in a way that feel valuable. It's not just about being cool and swishing around. It's about trying to create something that gives feedback to the user. So basically different brands, depending on what their product is and what it is they're trying to achieve, will focus on different aspects. These can be really fun to sort of sit and write down how you'd ideally make something work, but you also want people to read it. You want people to work from it. So it's good to build things with the context of what you're actually going to be working on, and think about the problems you actually want to solve, or how you want to drive the UX for the actual end user. And that way it makes more sense to kind of build as you go, not start without any plan, but make sure that the two things are working together, that you don't have to like have a fully written docs before you can start building anything. You're always going to be going back and forth. Similarly with components, you might use something once and feel like this is a one-off, just this page is going to have this element. It's only when you go to use it on a second page you say, okay, this is now going to work in a couple of places and it's slightly different, but there's still a lot of duplication. Don't repeat yourself. So this could be a component. At that point you're making a case for a component, rather than before you even start saying, let's begin by building 30 components without any idea about whether they're actually going to be used or where. You just like the idea of having a component library. You're just kind of building in legacy problems here. You're building in things that aren't going to be used, you're not going to need for the sake of having a nice display. It would make more sense to start with 2 components. Just like, these are the things we're going to have headings on every page, we're going to have a button on every page, we know this. And then as time goes on, something has to make a case to you of saying, I need to be a component because I'm being used in a few places and I have a few adaptions and rules that mean that this would make more sense for me to be something reusable. It kind of makes a case about what you actually choose to use, because a bit like style libraries, you don't really want to pull in the big bootstrap 2 megabyte library because you want to solve a couple of things, or you've got one form on your page, because you're basically pulling in a whole 100 things. You're bringing in icons, you're bringing in grids, you're bringing in all these things that you're not going to need. You've bloated all your code and you solve one tiny problem. It really just suggests a kind of messy approach. Similarly, if you lean into some, and there are thousands of amazing component libraries out there, you're going to bring all these in, but you really just want to do a modal, it's not the best. You might be able to find that the ones let you import selectively and they won't massively affect your bundle size. But every time you do that, you are handing off part of the design choices to your actual design team, because you want to build a drop-down component you think it's going to be too much messing with, so instead you decide we're just going to pull in a third-party one. Then further down the line, you want to extend this component. You want to make it searchable with a type ahead that's going to give results. You want to have an X in the corner that you click and it will clear it. You want to have animations that when you click, the results slide down. You'd like to have themable options, so the backgrounds are going to change color depending on context. You might find you've massively limited yourself because you used the third-party one. So now you're going to have to build the thing from scratch, which means now you're going to have to try and match the styles to look like the third-party one you bought in, or you're going to have to just rebuild it, and that will be confusing to users that your drop-downs completely changed how they work. So by choosing to grab something off the shelf, you'll get that short-term gain. You'll get some immediately up-to-scratch built thing, which might have accessibility, keyboard controls, it might have all the right tags, it might be very easy to use, but you've basically cornered yourself straight away and know that we're now dependent on that library for any new features or extendability, or we're going to have to scrap it and rebuild our own. So pulling in a third-party library for 10 different components, suddenly you've really baked a problem for yourself, in that we're basically going to have to down completely and rebuild all our components if we get into too much trouble further down the line. It might make more sense that you use some third-party styles, some sort of third-party library, just to give you some standards, some reset values, just so you get something that looks basically nice but can always be extended by you and won't create style clashes if you have to do that. But generally, to give you more control, much like the Apple guys or the Adobe guys are deciding we really want to focus on animations, we want to really focus on copy. If you are really focused on one thing or one area that you really want to make a particular hallmark of your brand, you've got to make a decision about where those components are going to come from, or how much control you're going to want over them going forward. The bottom line is that it's an organic thing, so you're going to want to grow with your components and grow with your design system to make this thing always extendable, and you want to make sure you've given yourself room to roam, rather than it being this project. We talked a lot about accessibility in some previous videos. We said it's not a one-time you go away and do accessibility, it's a mindset. And I think having a design system in place means that your team is going to have to share a mindset about what you're trying to build and how it works. And that way it makes it actually valuable for everyone to work on. That's all on that. We're going to look at some of the kind of flip sides, some of the problems in another video. But have a lovely day.